Hello, everyone. My name is Diso Orsano, and this is my honors project. It's about food insecurity and it takes a little bit of a look into futuristic agriculture. This project was done for the environmental science class, and I just didn't have a chance to present in class. So we're doing a video. So first off, let's start with what food insecurity is. This is a lack of access to nutritious foods, that being food that can support a healthy lifestyle. It has a few causes such as poverty, no affordable housing, lack of access to food sources, disabilities, or lack of time. The effect, especially in children, is the children's growth can be stunted. These people tend to have a lack of medical care, and because they are food insecure, they have an increased chance of chronic illnesses, and such as obesity, diabetes, cancer, heart disease, and more. These illnesses can be the lack of a nutritious diet or lack of calories overall. There's also elevated stress, because some families have to make difficult choices, such as do we eat food this today or do we pay the bills, which that's quite a stressful situation to be in. I would like to point out that the majority of people in poverty are under the age of 6 or are considered minors. In the US, at least, a minor is anyone who's still under the care of their parents, which I typically think of that as less than 18. So that would be this side. And as you can see, these are where the higher numbers of poverty are found. Once you move into the technical adults and older age, you kind of see less poverty instances. However, some elders do tend to be more at risk of poverty. The reason why this is important is because kids are especially affected by lack of nutrition, as they are still growing and their bodies are developing. So they really need the nutritious food in order to sustain their growth. So yeah, y-axis is the percentage of people in poverty, and then that x-axis is like the age range. So under 6, 6 to 11, 12 to 7 years of age, and then you hit the adults. This being like the working class, 18 to 59, and so on and so forth. There's also these things called food stamps. I'll get to those in a second. On the left, you have a graph of poverty throughout California by the county. A darker red is high rates of poverty. You can really see that in the valley here. And on the right are the amount of food stamps, or how many households receive food stamps by the county. Since it is relatively low with only like one red, when you can see there's quite a bit more poverty than the food stamps are reflecting. What food stamps are, they're part of the SNAP program. They're also considered EBT, or electronic benefits transfer. So that's basically like California or the federal government providing money for people to purchase like produce and nutritious food. Since we're talking about food insecurity, let's talk about the range of food security. Oftentimes when we think food insecurity, we're thinking someone who doesn't have anything to eat at all and is always going hungry. When in reality, there's kind of two versions of food insecurity. The very low is this section over here, where people report multiple instances where they either reduce the amount of food they are consuming, or it's low quality, or they have very little variety in their diet. Think of someone who eats mac and cheese every day because that's what they can afford. This is considered food insecure with hunger, and this affects about 5.1 million households, which granted, it's only about 4% of US households, but that's still a lot of people. Low food security, food insecurity without hunger. This is a bit more households, about 6.6% of US households, or 8.6 million households. So that's not even people. Like a household is whoever lives in the house with you. And then you have, this is considered food secure. Like you're okay, you have plenty of food, you can provide for a nutritious diet. High is like you have no issue. That's about 89.5% of households. And then marginal, food security, they have some anxiety about having access to food, but they're still considered food secure. And this is a graph with some questions that they might ask on a survey to determine food security or food insecurity. For example, you're worried if food would run out. The food that you did buy, perhaps it didn't last that long. Or you could not afford a balanced meal, you cut the size of the meal. What surprised me is did not eat for a whole day in like a 3-month span. You lost weight because you didn't eat. You were hungry, but you didn't eat. You skipped meals and so, things like that. As you can see, the people who are considered food secure experience very little of any of these. They do tend to experience some of the worry that food would run out, the food that they bought did not last as long as they thought it would, or they can afford a balanced meal. That's kind of where the marginal food security plays in. But then you have the low food insecurity, which if you remember, that's the food insecurity without hunger, where their variety and quality of their diet is affected, but not the amount that they intake. That's this kind of darker blue. And you can see it's higher in the higher questions, but then once you go down to the you were hungry but didn't eat, that's significantly less than the very low food security. And then for the eating, like going a whole day without eating, that's almost exclusively the very low food insecurity or food insecurity with hunger, because these are the people that are going hungry. This is just another graphic to show that children are the most likely to be affected, right? Because if you're younger than high school, you're in elementary or middle school, and that's the majority of people who are affected by food insecurity, at least in the education system. That's why we have the free and reduced lunch programs. What these programs do is it provides students at public schools with a free lunch if they qualify. And now we're going to transition over a little bit because we do hear that children are the most likely to be in poverty, but then you also see an increase in like obesity and children being overweight in the recent years. So you wouldn't normally think that if you're food insecure, you're going to be overweight, right? You would think, okay, you're going to lose weight because you're eating less food. But you have to remember that food insecurity is not just the amount of food you consume, it's also the quality that you eat. That's why it includes the nutritious food. But right now we're going to talk about obesity. I know it's a bit of a fast transition, but I hope it'll make sense in a little bit. So I'm sure everyone listening to this has at least heard of obesity. It's when your body mass index or your weight exceeds like the average or the kind of healthy standard for your body type, like your height kind of thing. And if you're overweight, then you're kind of over that, which puts a lot of pressure onto your knees and your back. It also increases your risk for cardiovascular diseases and heart diseases. And it's kind of interesting because you see higher obesity rates in people of color, while you also see higher poverty rates in people of color, which can be a little confusing. Again, if you think you're food insecure, you don't think you're going to be eating like so many calories that you become overweight. If you're in food insecure, our first instinct is, okay, you're going hungry, you're not eating enough. This is just another graphic to show like the Hispanic and Black African American communities are hit harder by the obesity epidemic than say, I can't say all things, the non-Hispanic Asians and the white Americans. And the reason for this kind of boils down to fast food, because if you're food insecure, you're gonna go with whatever's easiest and cheapest. And in the short term, fast food tends to be the cheapest option. It also tends to be the option that is the fastest. So these are just some graphics that illustrate that eating homemade food actually costs less than fast food. However, you have to remember that food insecure people tend to work multiple jobs, so they're kind of short on time. Furthermore, they tend to not have the money up front. So if you were to buy groceries, that's an easy $100 versus if you were to buy a meal, that's $5 to $10, right? So it's the same reason why low-income people don't tend to buy in bulk, even though buying in bulk is cheaper. So the portion of their diet that is healthy, nutritious foods tends to be a lot less than the amount that they eat in fast foods. Then another aspect is that it's a lot easier to find unhealthy fast food, or they need to drive a lot further in order to get nutritious options. And these areas are called food deserts. So here's a map of just some farmer markets in the area. This link here is just a farmer market finder, and that's where the map comes from. As you can see, I kind of live like in this Linwood Compton area, and there's no farmers markets anywhere nearby. If you were to live, so say like here, right, you'd have to drive pretty far to reach a farmer's market. So this is what low access healthy food kind of looks like. Statistically, it's when 30% of the population, or at least 500 people, live far away from a food store, whereas a food store is any supermarket, grocery store, or a farmer's market that carries like all the major food groups, your grains, your leafy greens, your fruit, etc. And about 13.5 million people live in food deserts, such as these defined by the low access definition. And about 82% of those live in an urban area. This is just a little video explaining market match. As you can see here, you have EBT, no benefits, and market match for the different farmers markets that you can reach out to, kind of, or attend. EBT is the same as the food stamps, and that's government provided money so that you can buy produce. I'm including this stuff because part of this assignment was to include a resource that people who are experiencing food insecurity could use. So if you are food insecure, you could apply for SNAP or EBT benefits. I think in California it's called CalFresh. And then you would get money to use at farmers markets such as these. Then you also have market match, which, as this video explains, allows you to use your EBT card and either get a 50% discount or get the amount on your EBT card matched. So it kind of helps you stretch that money a little further. And this is just another display of farmers markets and their availability by region per like 1,000 people. You can have like not even one, like the dark red, the highest is like 1.5. Which as you can see, there's not many of those spots in California. And then this is another graphic illustrating the difference between a food desert and an area that isn't a food desert. So as you can see, South LA, which is a lot bigger, there's more people per grocery store. So that means longer lines. I don't know about you, but when I walk in somewhere and see a long line, I don't want to be there. There's also less farmers markets, and a lot more of their restaurants are fast foods, like 72% versus the 41% in West LA. And then there's also a lot more liquor stores. The results of this are South LA adults are 2 times less likely to eat their fruits and veggies. Their children and themselves are more likely to be obese, going back to that obesity epidemic, and that causes their death rate to be higher. Now, this is another kind of transition slide. We know fast food is bad for our health, but it's also kind of bad for our environment because it does promote the overuse of antibiotics. A lot of people eat food dyes along with their processed foods, and that has been linked to hyperactivity in children, which causes them to perform worse in school. There's also an excess sugar consumption in people, which ties back to the diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is often considered to be caused by an insulin resistance. The idea is you eat so much sugar that your body stops responding to it, and then you're diabetic. There's also pesticides that are used to grow these crops, confined animal feeding operations, which are like think big animal feeding lots, right? You have your pesticides, your big animal feedlots, where they're just eating up your grain, and this can be pretty detrimental to the environment. As you can see over here, you have like this pool of manure, which, as you can imagine, people don't really want that around their house. There's also soil erosion, just due to how agriculture works. We tend to use a lot of monocultures and a lot of tilling. And then there's a lot of CO2 produced by the fast food industry. This slide here with the fish is showing eutrophication, where you have excess of nutrients in the water, which promotes an algae bloom. The algae then die and are decomposed. This consumes a lot of oxygen from the water and basically causes anything in the ocean or body of water to suffocate in a hypoxic zone, because they just don't have enough oxygen. I know not all of these factors are specific to the fast food industry, but they are like agriculture techniques that we use. And the fast food industry does promote the use of a lot of corn, wheat, and beef. This is more of a transition slide into our current agriculture system. This graphic is just showing how much revenue or how much market value we produce in terms of agricultural goods. California in particular, as you can see, is very agriculture dependent, especially in that valley area. Then you have the states over here that produce a lot of agricultural products, or they have a high market value for the agricultural products. Unfortunately, the majority of these agricultural products are animal-based. As you can see in this US agriculture pie chart, like almost half our agriculture value is based in meat or other animal products. For example, milk is an animal product of cattle. Granted, you're not, and then you also have cattle themselves. And you have this grain section, which it can be noted that a lot of grains are also used to feed the livestock, that because they need feed, they need to eat. And then grains are also processed and used in fast food and other processed foods. Like the amount of rice or the amount of corn that you eat off the cob is not exactly parallel to the amount of corn you can consume in, say, a bag of chips, even just from the high fructose corn syrup that is present in the chips. And then you also see a rise in genetically engineered crops. This is notable because these are kind of the crops that we rely on a lot. So that's soybean, cotton, and corn are some of our staple products. This map displays potential generators of food excess. I mentioned this because I wanted to include food waste somehow in here. Because despite growing all this amount in like agriculture products, we still waste a lot of food, either in shipping or at the grocery store when someone doesn't buy it, or the wholesalers decide it's no longer like marketable to sell, they'll throw it away. And my point for this slide is we should support more food banks or like reclamation of unsellable food. This can be seen as like composting the food instead of throwing it away and sending it to landfills. It can be seen as like providing it to food banks or charities before it gets so gross that it gets thrown away. And then as consumers ourselves, we can make sure that we purchase the food and use it instead of just letting it sit in the fridge and rot and go bad. This is kind of the EPA's hierarchy for the reclamation of food waste. So waste to avoid food waste. The first one is source reduction. So that's reducing the volume of surplus food generated. And as we often hear, there's a lot of people in the world going hungry. So it's a little strange to hear that all this food is being produced and it's so much food that we end up throwing it away. And yet there's a lot of hungry people. So then the second action is to feed those hungry people rather than throw the food away. Then after feeding people, you have feeding animals, and then converting those possibly wasted foods into industrial products. This was done for corn. There was a corn surplus because it was subsidized by the government, and as a result, we started making high fructose corn syrup. This is just a interesting little fact. 40% of the food produced is lost or wasted, and that a 15% reduction in food waste could feed 25 million Americans per year. So I feel like food waste is definitely an important topic that needs to be addressed. Now, we mentioned corn being grown as a surplus due to subsidies. Subsidies are government incentives given to businesses to improve the supply of a good or service. About 70% of farm subsidies go to growing these staple products called corn, wheat, and soybeans, often used to make processed foods. These subsidies can also tend to go to commercial farms, even though they're typically meant to help family farms or smaller farms. And they support intensive agriculture and support like the amount of processed foods we eat, because they are subsidizing these kind of base materials for those processed foods. As you can see in the graphic, corn is one of the most subsidized items, at least in 2016, followed by soybeans and sugar, and the list goes on. Subsidized crops are often used to make the processed foods that Americans consume. But when I first heard this, the rational idea was that, okay, crop subsidies cause fast food to be so prevalent and cheap. However, this is not quite true, because crop subsidies are not the only factor. When considering the price of fast food, farmers only get about 15% of the money used to buy processed foods, and then the rest goes to processing and advertising and such. So increasing crop prices would not exactly increase fast food prices. However, there are some factors that can help reduce consumption of fast food on a large scale. In particular, there could be a lot less advertising. A lot of ads are especially directed at children, especially for sugary products. What has been proven in other countries to work is a tax on sweetened drinks, and this will decline the drink sales, like a tax on soda. And then increased access to fresh produce and the ability to utilize this produce. So having more fresh produce closer to people, instead of having food deserts where people have to drive really far to purchase their fresh produce when they might not have the time or the energy to do so. Changing our agriculture can still be beneficial to our health and to the environment. For example, you can see that a lot of greenhouse gas emissions are produced by the production of like beef and lamb and these animal products like cheese, and then things such as peas and pulses are legumes, or like beans and lentils, and they're kind of grains. But that would help reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, which is why sometimes you hear people say, oh, you should go plant-based to help the environment, because animal product production does produce a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. But also, if you're eating an animal, you're eating on a higher trophic level versus eating from a plant. So if you're eating a cow, you're also using all the resources that it took to grow the grain that fed the cow versus if you just ate the grain itself. And you know, a cow goes through a lot of grain throughout its lifetime. So eating on a lower trophic level, so eating plant-based, can definitely help the environment as well. And then the others include like eutrophication, how much nutrient runoff is being added into the water sources by protein production, and then how much land is being used. You can tell that like cheese and beef and lamb, so kind of your ruminants take a lot of land. So that brings us around to agroforestry. Agro stands for agriculture, and forestry is the management of trees. So these are some examples of agroforestry. Let's look at the next slide. So there's alley cropping, which is alternating crop and tree rows. So that kind of looks like this one here, or this one, where you have one crop and you have a row of trees. What this does is it helps reduce the amount of soil erosion and also encourages like biodiversity because you have two different habitats right next to each other. Then there's windbreaks, also known as shelter belting. That's when you use planted trees to kind of slow down the wind speeds. So that will look like this one down here, where you see you have these big rows and you have these planted trees. And if they did it correctly, the wind's going to come through and the trees are going to slow down the wind speeds. Instead of it having a straight runway to go by, it's going to have these trees just blocking the wind and slowing it down. That means there's less soil erosion because the wind isn't hitting this ground as hard. Then you have riparian buffers. These are forested areas around bodies of water. They help filter runoff. So that looks like this, where you have your fields. Then you have this dense network of trees and plants all around the river. So the roots and just the structures of all these plants will slow down any water runoff that's coming from the fields, and that'll help trap sediment and keep it from entering the river. That kind of helps reduce eutrophication. And you have shaded crop production or forest farming. Here you use trees to provide shade to like delicate crops. The traditional way is to use these big nets that kind of provide shade to the crops. And the agroforestry way is to just plant trees there instead of having these big nets. That just helps increase carbon sequestration, because instead of using these nets that are going to break and you have to build them again, or using these trees, which they can be used for production or they can just be used for shade. Either way, they're helping trap carbon in a way that these nets would not. Then you have shaded grazing area. So this is where grazing animals are eating alongside with tree production. So that looks like this one here. We're having these trees that you're growing for, say, lumber or some other purpose. For example, these are walnut trees. And then you have your ruminants or grazing animals kind of controlling the weeds around the trees. And finally, you have a living snow fence where plants are placed to trap snow. So that's this one right here. You see this row of plants here that traps snow from the field and keeps it from going into the road. As I mentioned before, agroforestry is agriculture with forests, and you're integrating trees into agriculture, trying to mimic the natural ecosystems and increasing the diversity of crops and life on your plot of land. This is a form of regenerative agriculture. This is something I would have liked to go further in detail with, but I ran out of time. So these are just the three types of agroforestry. There's agri-silviculture, which is crops plus trees. So that's kind of like the shaded agriculture. And then you have agro-silvopastoral. We have crops, animals, and trees. The animal tends to be bees because they're pollinating creatures, but it can be other animals such as ducks or chicken, anything like that. If you were in Dr. Jones's environmental biology class, this would be very similar to this podcast that we listened to with Soul Fire Farms, where they use the ducks alongside with their crops. And then there's silvopastoral, which combines the orchids with grazing pastures. This is very similar to this animal grazing under the trees kind of method. And these are just some examples of farms that are like using these methods. There's Watkins in UK. That's the one shown here. The Sierra de la Daestra in Portugal. That's the image shown here. And then the Investiencia, which is shown here. All right, another form of futuristic agriculture is vertical agriculture. This is some typical agriculture that a home gardener would do, right? You basically have the stacked pots, or you have some pots going up a wall. Like this can be a culinary garden where you have different herbs growing in your pots. But then on a larger scale, you can have these aquaponics systems. This one's like aeroponics, so you're using mist to give water to these plants. This one's more aquaponics, we're using the fish to provide nutrients for the plants growing above. And then this is just hydroponics, where you have water and a nutrient solution running through these poles and feeding the crops here. So again, aeroponics is you're using a nutrient-rich mist for the plants. And so it just bubbles up and drips down or sprays directly onto the roots. And then there's hydroponics, where you have the roots suspended in a nutrient-rich medium. They do need some air, but the roots are mostly in the water. Both of these are soilless, and they help reduce the amount of water that is used in growing the crops, because crops can take a lot of water, especially when they're outdoors. And as climate change progresses, we could be running low on our water supply. So finding water efficient methods such as this could be beneficial in the future. Furthermore, these don't necessarily need large plots of land, or they don't need like very fertile soil or perfect conditions, because they can be grown indoors. So this could be a viable way of growing produce in cities, so that you don't have to transport your produce as far. So this is just hydroponics is an umbrella term that includes aquaponics and aeroponics. It's basically any sort of agriculture that uses a nutrient-rich solution and water. In aquaponics, you use fish to produce a nutrient-rich solution, and aeroponics, or more traditional hydroponics, use a nutrient-rich solution. So you just mix nutrients yourself. So as I mentioned, these sort of systems can be beneficial to be used in cities. But they're not the only system. For example, these rain gardens are especially helpful to help build habitat for creatures, especially when we have a lot of manicured lawns. Native creatures tend to not have a lot of available habitat, and having a rain garden such as this, especially if you use native plants, provides vital habitat for these creatures. It also helps collect water. So as you notice, it's kind of like in an indent here. So instead of letting any water run off into the street and into the drain, you're catching that water and letting it seep into the soil. That helps build our water reservoir. As I mentioned earlier, with climate change, our water sources are running dry, especially because there's a lot more humans now, and so getting warmer. So anything that helps increase our groundwater recharge is really helpful, because we've just been using it without really recharging it. And in cities, we have a lot of concrete, which increases the speed of the runoff and doesn't give that water time to settle into the ground. These are just more forms of rain gardens. You can see this one was after rain, and it has like a little puddle. It's gonna fall back in. And this is just a little diagram of what it is. Ideally use native plants because they're a lot less maintenance and they provide habitat for native animals. You often fill it with sand because that'll trap the water a lot faster than the soil will. So it forms like a pool that can then seep into the existing soil. A larger scale of this are called bioswales. And this is something that the cities can use. Right here you have the curve, and it flooded with water, and the water can sink in rather than run off into the drain. A lot of big farms can also use this just to keep the water from flowing into the rivers as fast. And it's just another image of a bioswale. And another one. Alrighty, we're reaching the end of this slideshow. I'm just going to come back up here to remind you some things that we saw. Here we saw a market match on ABT. Here we saw that school-aged children tend to be in poverty more than adults. Food stamps here. And this is showing you the amount of people that use food stamps, or households that use food stamps. So that kind of plays into these helpful programs. But some of these are the ones that we saw. So CalFresh is California's version of the SNAP, or Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And that is what we consider food stamps. Nowadays it's called CalFresh. Back then it used to be called food stamps. So this is right here. That can be matched like by providing a 50% discount or using market match tokens at eligible market match farmers markets. And there's the ecology finder, the farmers market finder that we got that one graph from earlier. And then this is an application for CalFresh. If you do go to Mount St. Mary's, our sports and wellness department can definitely help you apply to these. And they do a lot of outreach to try and get people to apply. This one is specifically for women who are pregnant or have just delivered their child. Because young children can be especially affected by a lack of nutrients. Their growth can be stunted, and it can really affect their development. So this WICS program is meant to help these children receive, first off, the nutritious foods they need, and it also helps them receive care and immunization so that the child is ready for, it starts off its life in a healthy manner, which helps reduce infant deaths and nutrition deficiencies. Some other resources are CalWorks. This is for families with children. Any money given from CalWorks can go to any household needs, such as housing, medical care, clothing, utilities, and the child must be under 19 years old or not an adult. They can provide this financial help for short-term or long-term. Then this summer food service program is the free and reduced lunch. It has like any child under 18 years old can receive nutritious meals for free or for reduced lunch. This one is specifically for over the summer when school is not in session and these children might not have a source of food. And then the low income is defined by the household income. Reduced lunch is also known as the free and reduced lunch. There's about 5 programs that play into this one, and that's for when school is in session and students can receive free or reduced lunch from their school cafeteria. And that is the end of this presentation. I apologize that there were some very abrupt switches, and I just tend to be very scatterbrained sometimes, and I want to do everything and don't have the time to do everything. But I definitely appreciate you watching this, especially if you've reached the end of this YouTube video. These are all the links I used. And thank you so much. Hope you have a nice day.